And breeze, the metal shavings, fall like snow. The metal shavings fell like snow in the dimly lit workshop of the Tula Arms factory, each curl of steel catching the amber glow of overhead lamps. Georgy Shpagin bent over his workbench, calloused fingers tracing the crude barrel of what would become the most feared submachine gun in urban warfare. Outside, the winter of 1940 pressed against the windows like a living thing. And somewhere in the darkness beyond, Stalin's generals were learning that their grand theories about future warfare meant nothing when soldiers died in the rubble of burning cities. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the corridor outside. Shpagin didn't look up from his work, though his hands paused for just a moment. He'd learned to recognize the different rhythms of footsteps in this place. Supervisors walked with purpose, engineers shuffled with exhaustion, and military officials marched with the weight of orders they couldn't question. These boots belonged to Colonel Mikhail Degtyaryov, the factory's military liaison, the man who'd been dismissing Shpagin's urban warfare designs for 6 months, while Soviet boys died in Finnish snow with rifles meant for open fields. "Comrade Shpagin," Degtyaryov's voice carried the authority of someone who'd never held a weapon in actual combat. "The commission will review your device tomorrow morning." Shpagin finally looked up, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and something harder to name. In his workshop, surrounded by the tools his father had taught him to use, he felt the weight of every casualty report that crossed his desk. Each number represented someone's son, someone's husband, dying because military doctrine refused to acknowledge what the war had actually become. "It's ready," he replied quietly, gesturing toward the prototype that lay on his bench. The weapon looked crude compared to the elegant rifles the commission preferred, but Shpagin had learned that elegance meant nothing in the choking smoke and shattered concrete of Viipuri's ruins. The Red Army was hemorrhaging men faster than Soviet factories could replace them. The invasion of Finland had exposed a brutal truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. Modern war wasn't fought in the open fields where tanks and artillery could dominate. It was fought house by house, room by room, in spaces so tight that a rifleman couldn't work his bolt before an enemy submachine gun cut him down. Degtyaryov picked up the prototype, its weight surprising him. The commission still considers submachine guns inappropriate for professional forces. "Tell that to the men dying in Helsinki," Shpagin muttered, then caught himself. Such comments could cost him more than his job. Through the factory windows, snow continued to fall on Tula, the same snow that was burying Soviet soldiers 300 miles north. Shpagin had grown up understanding that survival meant making things work better, not making them prettier for parades. His father, Dmitri, had taught him that in the machine shops of Kovrov, where a failed part meant injury, not just embarrassment. The memory came suddenly, 13-year-old Georgy watching a steam pipe burst in his father's factory. While adults argued about procedures, he'd grabbed a crowbar and improvised a leverage system that freed 3 trapped workers. His father had later told him that innovation born from desperation often surpassed solutions crafted in comfort. Now, 27 years later, that lesson felt more urgent than ever. The prototype jammed during preliminary testing, Degtyaryov continued, setting the weapon down with obvious distaste. "After 40 rounds, Shpagin corrected. "I've modified the feeding mechanism since then. The new design fired 900 rounds without malfunction." For the first time, Degtyaryov's expression showed genuine interest rather than bureaucratic politeness. Soviet doctrine emphasized precision shooting and disciplined volleys, but reports from Finland told a different story. Soviet troops with bolt-action rifles were being outgunned by Finnish defenders wielding compact, rapid-fire weapons in the claustrophobic spaces of destroyed buildings. Military doctrine had failed catastrophically. The High Command, drunk on visions of mechanized warfare and grand maneuvers, had ignored the messy reality of close-quarters combat. Soldiers were dying not because they lacked courage, but because they carried weapons that couldn't keep pace with the intimate brutality of urban warfare. 900 rounds? Degtyaryov asked. Shpagin nodded, his fingers unconsciously tracing the scars on his hands, marks left by years of working with unforgiving steel. The generals needed a scapegoat for Finland. Instead, they got me. Outside, the winter wind howled through Tula's factory district, carrying the smell of coal smoke and machine oil that had defined Shpagin's entire life. Somewhere in that darkness, trains were carrying more young men toward a war that would test everything he'd built in this workshop. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. What happens when everything you've been taught about honor collides with what your own hands must create? The commission meeting took place in a room that smelled of cigarettes and fear. 12 officers sat around a polished table that reflected the harsh overhead lights, their faces masks of professional skepticism. Shpagin stood at the far end, his prototype laid out before him like evidence in a trial. General Fyodor Petrov, the commission's chairman, had the weathered face of a man who'd survived both revolution and purge. His fingers drummed impatiently on the table as he studied the weapon that looked nothing like the sophisticated rifles Soviet engineers usually produced. Explain to us, Comrade Shpagin, why the Red Army needs a weapon that resembles something criminals might use. The question hung in the air like smoke. Shpagin had prepared for this moment, but standing before these men, most of whom had never held a weapon in genuine combat, he felt the familiar weight of being an outsider in his own country. Born into poverty in the provincial town of Kovrov, Shpagin had learned early that survival meant understanding how things worked, and more importantly, how to make them work better. His father, a factory worker whose hands bore the permanent stains of machine oil, had taught him that genius wasn't about grand theories, but about solving immediate deadly problems with whatever materials lay at hand. Because the war isn't what we thought it would be, he answered simply. Murmurs rippled around the table. Such directness bordered on insubordination, but Shpagin had watched too many casualty reports pile up to care about protocol. The Finnish campaign demonstrated that urban warfare requires different tools, he continued. Our soldiers enter buildings with rifles designed for battlefields. They're dying because they can't return adequate volume of fire in spaces where combat is measured in seconds, not minutes. Colonel Degtyaryov shifted uncomfortably. The reports from Finland painted a picture that military doctrine hadn't anticipated. Red Army units pinned down in city blocks, unable to advance because Finnish defenders could fire multiple rounds before a Soviet rifleman could work his bolt. General Petrov picked up the prototype, his expression revealing nothing. This drum magazine holds how many rounds? 71, Shpagin replied. Enough firepower to dominate any room or corridor. And maintenance? Simple construction. Field maintenance requires no specialized tools. The tactical reality demanded exactly what Shpagin envisioned, but admitting that meant acknowledging that decades of military thinking had been wrong. Young Georgy had spent his childhood dismantling clocks, rebuilding bicycle parts, and imagining mechanisms that didn't yet exist. Now his imagination had to save lives that doctrine was throwing away. In the back of the room, a younger officer named Captain Boris Larionov had been taking notes. Unlike the others, he'd actually served in Finland, had seen urban warfare's intimate brutality firsthand. "Permission to speak, sir?" Larionov asked. Petrov nodded grudgingly. "I've seen what happens when our men enter buildings with bolt-action rifles. The weapon Comrade Shpagin describes, it matches what we needed in Viapuri." The room fell silent. Larionov's words carried the weight of actual experience, something most commission members lacked. Shpagin's personal obsession grew from watching those casualty reports pile up on factory bulletin boards. Each number represented someone's son, someone's father, dying because available weapons couldn't match the tactical environment. He'd worked 18-hour days, surviving on bread and determination, sketching designs that prioritized reliability over elegance, function over form. "Show us," Petrov said finally. The demonstration took place in the factory's testing range, a concrete bunker that echoed with the sound of gunfire. Shpagin loaded the prototype carefully, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The first prototype had failed spectacularly during testing, jamming after 40 rounds. Military observers had smirked and prepared dismissive reports, but Shpagin had anticipated that failure. He'd worked through the night, modifying the feeding mechanism and simplifying the bolt design. Now, as he squeezed the trigger, the weapon responded with a steady rhythm that filled the bunker. Round after round fed smoothly through the mechanism he'd redesigned, brass casings falling like the metal shavings in his workshop. When the magazine emptied, the silence felt profound. Shpagin reloaded and fired again, the weapon functioning exactly as he'd promised. After 900 rounds, it still operated without malfunction, a performance that silenced every critic in the room. But resistance continued even then. Senior officers argued that submachine guns were gangster weapons, unsuitable for professional military forces. The breakthrough came when junior officers, veterans of Finnish combat like Larionov, began to speak quietly among themselves, their conversations carrying truths that contradicted official doctrine. Word spread through enlisted ranks with the speed of whispered secrets. Finally, someone had created a weapon that worked the way urban warfare actually happened. The commission members filed out in silence, leaving Shpagin alone with his prototype. Through the bunker's narrow windows, he could see Tula's smokestacks reaching toward a grey February sky. Soon, if his weapon was approved, those same smokestacks would be producing thousands of submachine guns. But Shpagin already carried a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. How many lives would his creation save, and how many would it take? The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty bunker as he gathered his tools. Outside, the winter of 1940 pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, Stalin's generals were finally beginning to learn that their grand theories about warfare meant nothing when soldiers died in the rubble of burning cities. The approval came 3 weeks later, buried in a directive that changed the designation from experimental design to PPSH-41, Pistolet Pulemio Shpagina. The weapon that emerged from Shpagin's workshop embodied a revolutionary philosophy. War wasn't won by the most sophisticated weapon, but by the one that functioned reliably when everything else failed. Shpagin stood in the expanded production facility, watching workers assemble the first mass-produced units. The sight should have filled him with pride, but instead he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like snow. Each weapon rolling off the assembly line carried his name, his understanding that soldiers needed tools that worked, not monuments to engineering complexity. The letter from home arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same clerk who brought technical specifications and production reports. Shpagin recognized his sister Katya's handwriting immediately, careful script formed by a schoolteacher's patient hand. "My dear Georgie," the letter began, "we received your photograph with the new weapon. Mother cried when she saw it, though she wouldn't say whether from pride or fear. Father says you've done what needed doing, the way you always have since that day with the steam pipe." The memory surfaced again. 13-year-old Georgie, improvising a leverage system while adults argued about procedures. That moment had taught him that innovation born from desperation often surpassed solutions crafted in comfort. Now, 27 years later, that lesson had become the PPSH-41. The newspapers here speak of great victories, but we hear other stories from the wives whose husbands return on leave. The war is not what they promised us, is it? Your weapon. Will it help them come home? Shpagin folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket, next to the production reports that showed an ambitious goal: 100,000 units by year's end. The mathematics of warfare were unforgiving. Every PPSH-41 that preserved a Red Army soldier's life might also end another human being's existence. He found himself thinking about the young soldiers who would carry his weapon. Boys from villages like his own Kovrov, raised on bread and hope, trained to believe in causes larger than themselves. They would hold the PPSH-41's distinctive wooden stock, feel its weight, and perhaps never know the name of the man who designed it to keep them alive. Captain Larionov visited the factory again in March, this time wearing the ribbon of the Order of the Red Banner. His left hand moved stiffly, a reminder of combat that made his opinions about weapons carry particular weight. "The men are calling it the Papasha," he told Shpagin as they walked through the production line. "Daddy, they trust it. More than their rifles, more than anything we've given them before." The conversation paused as they watched a technician test-fire a completed unit. The weapon's distinctive sound, rapid, controlled, deadly, echoed through the factory. Shpagin had heard that sound hundreds of times now, but it still made him think of his father's hands, permanently stained with machine oil, building things that mattered. "How many are we producing weekly?" Larionov asked. 3,000. By summer, 5,000. Larionov nodded grimly. Such numbers suggested a war much longer than anyone had anticipated. Outside, spring was beginning to touch Tula. Snow melted from factory rooftops, revealing the industrial landscape that had shaped Shpagin's entire life. But rumors from the west spoke of a different kind of storm gathering: German forces massing along borders, preparing for conflicts that would dwarf Finland's urban warfare. The doctrinal blindness of military leadership had been cracking since Finland, but slowly, like ice breaking under spring warmth. While generals had debated theoretical advantages of precision shooting, privates had died because they couldn't return adequate volume of fire in spaces where combat was measured in seconds, not minutes. Now, as production of the PPSH-41 accelerated, Shpagin began to understand that his weapon would face tests far beyond Finnish cities. Reports filtered back to the factory, fragments of intelligence that suggested the next war would be fought on a scale that made Finland seem like a border skirmish. In his workshop, surrounded by the tools that had become extensions of his hands, Shpagin continued refining the design. Small improvements, a more efficient recoil spring, a smoother bolt face, adjustments that would make the weapon even more reliable in conditions he could barely imagine. But late at night, when the factory fell quiet and only security guards patrolled the empty halls, Shpagin sometimes stood at his window and wondered about the boys who would carry his creation. Some would survive because of the PPSH-41's firepower. Others would die despite it. The mathematics of warfare admitted no moral neutrality. The irony was already beginning to haunt him. He had created his masterpiece to save Soviet lives, but the weapon's effectiveness would also escalate urban combat's lethality. Every advantage gained by one side forced the other to respond with greater violence, creating cycles of innovation driven by the fundamental human desire to survive. His sister's letter remained in his pocket like a talisman, a reminder that somewhere beyond the factory walls, ordinary people lived ordinary lives touched by extraordinary times. They trusted him to create tools that would bring their sons home. He could only hope that trust wasn't misplaced. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When creation becomes both salvation and burden, which weighs more heavily on the soul. June 22nd, 1941. The date arrived with radio static and urgent voices cutting through the summer morning. German forces had crossed the Soviet border at dawn, launching Operation Barbarossa with a fury that shattered illusions of peace. In the Tula factory, production of the PPSH-41 shifted from ambitious goal to desperate necessity. Shpagin stood in the redesigned facility, watching workers operate around the clock in 12-hour shifts. The assembly lines that had produced 3,000 weapons weekly now churned out double that number. The metal shavings fell like snow in multiple workshops now, each one a mirror of his original bench where everything had begun. The first field reports arrived within days, carried by wounded soldiers evacuated from the front. Unlike the formal assessments that usually filtered through military channels, these accounts came directly from men who'd carried the PPSH-41 into combat against an enemy that fought with precision and overwhelming force. Senior Lieutenant Pavel Volkov had lost his left eye to German shrapnel, but his right hand still moved with the muscle memory of operating Shpagin's weapon. He sat in the factory's administrative office, his voice steady despite obvious exhaustion. In Minsk, we held an apartment building for 6 hours with 12 men and 8 PPSH-41s, he reported. German infantry tried to clear us room by room. They couldn't. Shpagin listened from the corner, taking notes that wouldn't appear in any official report. These conversations mattered more than commission meetings because they revealed how his creation actually functioned when everything else failed. The sound, Volkov continued. When Germans heard the Papasha's rate of fire, they knew they were facing something different. It changed how they approached urban positions. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union, they had encountered something unexpected in the ruins of contested cities, defenders who could match their firepower in close combat. The PPSH-41 was transforming urban warfare doctrine, proving that tactical innovation often emerged from understanding ground-level reality rather than theoretical strategy. But transformation came at a cost that Shpagin was only beginning to comprehend. Dr. Yelena Marchenko, the factory's medical officer, began documenting what she called production stress syndrome among workers. 12-hour shifts, constant pressure, and the knowledge that every delay might cost lives created psychological burdens that traditional medicine couldn't address. She found Shpagin in his workshop late one evening, hunched over blueprints for an improved magazine spring. His hands moved with practiced precision, but she noticed the tremor that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. "When did you last sleep more than 4 hours?" she asked. He looked up, his eyes reflecting the overhead lamp's amber glow. "Sleep feels like luxury when men are dying. Men die regardless of how many hours you work. The question is whether you'll be capable of helping them when this war ends." Dr. Marchenko had treated factory injuries for 15 years, but the current conflict presented challenges that went beyond physical trauma. Workers pushed themselves beyond sustainable limits, driven by a sense of personal responsibility for strangers they'd never meet. "The design is nearly perfect," Shpagin said, gesturing toward the blueprints. "Minor improvements in the feeding mechanism could increase reliability by another 3%. At what cost to yourself?" The question hung between them like smoke from the factory's furnaces. Shpagin had learned to ignore his body's protests, to push through exhaustion that would have felled most men. But Dr. Marchenko understood that human beings, like mechanical systems, had limits that couldn't be exceeded indefinitely. Production numbers told their own story. Over 100,000 PPSH-41s manufactured by August, with quotas increasing monthly. Each weapon carried Shpagin's fingerprints, his understanding that soldiers needed tools that worked, not monuments to engineering complexity. Captain Larionov returned from his second combat assignment in September, this time bearing reports from the Leningrad front. The siege that had begun in August was testing every assumption about urban warfare, creating conditions that exceeded even Finnish combat's intensity. "The Germans are using our own tactics now," he informed Shpagin. They've developed their own submachine guns, copied some of our approaches. Your design forced them to adapt. Shpagin absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Military innovation had always been cyclical, one side's advantage prompting the other's response, but seeing his work drive enemy adaptations felt unsettling. Are our men holding? Better than anyone expected. The PPSH-41 gives them confidence in close quarters. They know they can match German firepower room by room. But Larionov's expression suggested complications that his words didn't convey. Urban warfare was evolving beyond anyone's predictions, creating situations where survival depended on split-second decisions made by exhausted soldiers carrying weapons designed by men who'd never faced combat themselves. In his workshop that night, Shpagin examined a PPSH-41 returned from the front. The weapon showed wear patterns that revealed how soldiers actually used his creation. Scratches from concrete walls, dents from rough handling, modifications made in field conditions by men whose lives depended on reliability. These marks told stories he couldn't read completely, but they suggested that his weapon had become more than a tool. For soldiers facing overwhelming odds, the PPSH-41 represented possibility, the chance to fight effectively even when everything else seemed hopeless. The responsibility weighed on him like winter cold. Every design decision he made would multiply across thousands of weapons, affecting outcomes he could never fully predict or control. His father had taught him to solve immediate problems with available materials, but this problem extended far beyond any single workshop or factory. Outside, autumn was painting Tula in shades of gold and red. Soon winter would return, bringing challenges that would test his creation under conditions even harsher than Finland had provided. The war was expanding beyond anyone's ability to control or predict, and the PPSH-41 had become one small part of a vast machine grinding through human lives with mechanical indifference. How much responsibility can one man's hands carry before they begin to shake? The letter arrived in November, delivered through channels that bypassed normal military correspondence. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Kozlov, writing from a field hospital near Stalingrad, had somehow learned Shpagin's name and address. His handwriting showed the careful precision of someone accustomed to detailed work, perhaps an engineer or technician before the war. Comrade Shpagin. The letter began, I write this, knowing you may never read it, but I must tell someone what your weapon has meant to men like me. My unit has defended the same building for 43 days. Without the papasha, we would have lasted perhaps 4. Shpagin read these words in his workshop, surrounded by the familiar sounds of metal being shaped into instruments of war. Production had reached 5,000 units weekly, with new facilities opening across the Soviet Union. The PPSH-41 had become ubiquitous on the Eastern Front, its distinctive drum magazine and wooden stock as recognizable as any Soviet symbol. But I must also tell you something else. Kozlov's letter continued. Yesterday we captured a German position. Among their equipment we found copies of your design, crude copies but functional. They call it the MP-40I. Your creation is killing Soviet soldiers now, carried by enemy hands. The words hit Shpagin like a physical blow. He'd understood intellectually that military innovation prompted counter-innovation, but seeing it described so directly forced him to confront the ultimate irony of his work. The weapon he'd created to save Soviet lives was now being turned against them by an enemy that had studied and adapted his design principles. The central secret that had been growing in his mind for months finally crystallized. There was no such thing as a weapon that only killed the right people. Every innovation in the art of war eventually spread beyond its creator's intentions, becoming part of a larger machinery that ground through human lives without regard for nationality or ideology. Dr. Marchenko found him that evening, still holding Kozlov's letter. His hands shook slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of understanding that had been building since June. "You've read something that troubles you," she observed. Shpagin handed her the letter without comment. She read it carefully, her medical training allowing her to recognize symptoms of psychological distress that others might miss. "Did you believe your weapon would remain uniquely Soviet forever?" she asked gently. "No, but I hoped." He couldn't finish the sentence because he wasn't certain what he'd hoped. That war could be made more humane, that providing Soviet soldiers with better weapons would somehow shorten the conflict, that his contribution would tip the balance decisively toward victory. The production reports on his desk told a different story. Over 600,000 PPSH-41s manufactured since February, with orders for another million before year's end. Each weapon carried the potential to save one life and take another, to create moments of triumph and tragedy that would ripple through families and communities for generations. Captain Larionov returned from Stalingrad in December, bearing decorations and scars that spoke of combat beyond most men's capacity to endure. His reunion with Shpagin took place in the factory's administrative office, but their conversation carried the weight of battlefield truths that no office could contain. "The German copies aren't as reliable as yours," Larionov reported, "but they're learning. Each month their weapons improve." "How many of our men have been killed by weapons based on my design?" Larionov paused, recognizing the question's deeper implications. "That's not how war works, comrade. Every innovation spreads. Your submachine guns saved more Soviet lives than it cost." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen what happens when units have PPSH-41s and when they don't. The difference is measurable." But Larionov's certainty couldn't ease the weight Shpagin carried. In his workshop that night, he examined the latest production model of his creation. The weapon had evolved since his original prototype. Improved metallurgy, refined tolerances, small changes that increased reliability and accuracy. Each modification represented lessons learned from combat, feedback from soldiers who'd used the weapon under conditions he could barely imagine. The PPSH-41 had become a collaborative creation, shaped by the collective experience of thousands of men who'd carried it into situations where failure meant death. The irony haunted him with increasing intensity. He had created his masterpiece to save Soviet lives, but the weapon's effectiveness had also escalated urban combat's lethality. Every PPSH-41 that preserved a Red Army soldier's life had potentially ended another human being's existence. The mathematics of warfare admitted no moral neutrality. A second letter from Kozlov arrived in January, this one bearing news that crystallized Shpagin's fears. The lieutenant's unit had been overrun by German forces using submachine guns clearly derived from Soviet designs. Kozlov himself had survived, but 12 men in his company had been killed by weapons that traced their lineage back to Shpagin's workshop. "I do not blame you," Kozlov wrote. "War creates its own logic, and weapons are tools that serve whoever holds them. But I thought you should know. Your creation has traveled farther than you intended." Shpagin folded the letter and placed it beside Kozlov's first message. Together, they represented the central paradox of his life's work, the impossibility of creating something that killed only enemies, saved only friends, served only righteous causes. In the months that followed, production of the PPSH-41 would continue accelerating. By war's end, over 6 million units would be manufactured, more than any other submachine gun in history. The weapon would appear on battlefields across Eastern Europe, carried by Soviet soldiers, resistance fighters, and eventually by former enemies who'd inherited stockpiles. But in his workshop during those winter nights of 1942, Shpagin began to understand the price of innovation driven by necessity. Every solution created new problems, every advantage prompted new threats, every weapon designed to end conflict instead perpetuated it. The metal shavings continued falling like snow, each curl of steel carrying the promise of salvation and the certainty of suffering in measures that no human mathematics could balance. What haunts an inventor more, the lives his creation saves or the ones it takes? Victory Day, May 9th, 1945. The news reached Tula through radio broadcasts that crackled with static and joy. Church bells rang across the city, their sound mixing with factory whistles and voices raised in celebration. The war was over, and the Soviet Union stood triumphant after sacrifices that defied comprehension. Shpagin stood in his workshop, surrounded by the tools that had shaped his life and the lives of millions. The final production tallies lay on his desk. 6,078,000 PPSH-41s manufactured during 4 years of conflict. Each number represented a weapon that had carried his name into combat, his understanding that soldiers needed tools that worked rather than monuments to engineering complexity. But victory felt hollow when measured against the weight of what he'd learned about his creation's true nature. Doctor. Marchenko found him there as evening fell, still staring at reports that documented the PPSH-41's global spread. Soviet-manufactured weapons had reached resistance fighters across Eastern Europe. Allied forces had captured German facilities producing modified versions. Chinese communist units carried PPSH-41s supplied through complex diplomatic channels. "The war is over," she said gently. "Your work saved countless Soviet lives and ended countless others. The weapons I designed, they'll outlast the war by decades." She sat beside him, noting how the amber light from his workbench lamp cast shadows that made him look far older than his 52 years. The toll of constant production, sleepless nights, and moral responsibility had carved lines in his face that wouldn't fade with peace. Did you expect to create a weapon that would disappear when fighting stopped? The question struck at the heart of Shpagin's evolving understanding. He'd begun designing the PPSH-41 to solve an immediate problem: Soviet soldiers dying in Finnish cities because their weapons couldn't match the tactical environment. But solutions to immediate problems often created long-term consequences that their creators never anticipated. Captain Larionov, now Major Larionov, visited the factory one final time before returning to civilian life. His uniform bore ribbons that told the story of 4 years spent carrying Shpagin's weapon through some of the war's most brutal campaigns. Their conversation took place in the same office where they'd first discussed urban warfare's realities. "What will you do now?" Larionov asked. "Continue working. The military has new projects, new requirements." "And personally?" Shpagin paused, considering a question he'd avoided for years. During the war, purpose had been clear: create weapons that kept Soviet soldiers alive, but peacetime offered no such clarity, only the complex legacy of innovation driven by desperate necessity. "I'm not certain. The world has enough weapons now." Larionov understood the weight behind those words. He'd seen the PPSH-41's impact firsthand, witnessed how it changed urban combat dynamics and forced enemy adaptations that escalated violence on both sides. Victory had been achieved, but at costs that would ripple through generations. In the months following Germany's surrender, Shpagin received letters from across the Soviet Union. Former soldiers who'd carried his weapon, families whose sons had survived because of the PPSH-41's reliability, veterans who credited the submachine gun with saving their lives in specific battles. But he also received other letters, harder ones to read. Widows whose husbands had been killed by weapons derived from his designs. Children asking why their fathers hadn't come home despite carrying the famous papasha. Questions that had no satisfying answers, because war created its own logic that transcended any individual's intentions. The irony that had begun haunting him in 1942 now dominated his thoughts. He'd created his masterpiece to save Soviet lives, but the weapon's effectiveness had also escalated urban combat's lethality. Every PPSH-41 that preserved a Red Army soldier's life had potentially ended another human being's existence. The mathematics of warfare admitted no moral neutrality. By 1947, production of the PPSH-41 had virtually ceased, replaced by new designs that incorporated lessons learned during the war. But Shpagin's creation continued spreading through global conflicts, appearing in Korea, Vietnam, and dozens of smaller wars where surplus Soviet weapons found new purposes. He began declining public appearances and interviews, preferring the solitude of his workshop to celebrations that felt increasingly hollow. When journalists asked about his legacy, he would run his fingers along his tools and speak carefully about the responsibility carried by those who translate necessity into steel. The metal shavings no longer fell like snow in his workshop. Peacetime projects required different materials, different approaches. But sometimes, especially during Tula's long winters, Shpagin would remember the sound they made, the gentle whisper of steel being shaped into instruments that would outlast their creator. In the decades following victory, Shpagin rarely spoke about his creation with anyone outside his immediate family. The PPSH-41 had become a symbol of Soviet industrial might, featured in parades and museums as evidence of wartime innovation. But for its creator, the weapon remained a reminder that innovation born from desperation leaves scars that never fully heal. His sister Katya visited him in 1960, bringing photographs of her grandchildren, boys too young to understand the war their grandfather's generation had endured. As they played in Shpagin's garden, their laughter mixed with sounds from the nearby factory where new weapons were being developed for conflicts that hadn't yet begun. "Do you regret creating it?" Katya asked during a quiet moment. Shpagin watched his great-nephew attempt to fix a broken toy, the boy's small hands working with the same focused determination that had once driven innovation in desperate times. "I regret that it was necessary," he answered finally, "but not that I made it work." History would remember the PPSH-41 as one of the war's most successful weapons, produced in greater numbers than any other submachine gun. Military historians would analyze its impact on urban warfare doctrine, its role in Soviet victory, its influence on subsequent weapon designs. But in the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured. It was the man who dared to imagine it, and who carried the weight of that imagination for the rest of his life. The amber light in his workshop burned late into many nights as Georgy Shpagin continued working, driven by the same impulses that had shaped his father's hands and would perhaps someday shape his great-nephew's. The metal shavings might no longer fall like snow, but the responsibility remained to solve immediate problems with available materials, to make things work when everything else was failing, even when those solutions carried consequences that no mathematics could balance, no conscience could fully reconcile. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. When the snow finally melts, what remains of the choices we made in winter?